Hello and welcome back to the Advanced English Podcast, the podcast specifically designed for C1 and C2 level learners who are looking to bridge the gap between intermediate speech and true native fluency. I'm Hayley, and today we're going to be looking at a topic that's deeply personal to me, but also something that affects every single one of us on a fundamental level, and that is family and genealogy. But before we get the ball rolling, I do have a quick reminder for you. If you want to really master the complex vocabulary we use today, make sure to click the link in the description to download the full transcript. And even better, you can head over to our vocabulary platform where you can interactively practice all the advanced phrasal verbs, idioms, and collocations from this episode so that they actually stick. You can click the link above or you can click it in the description below as well. Right, so let's get stuck in, shall we? So have you ever sat down and actually asked yourself, what is family anyway? Like, it sounds like one of those dead simple questions with an obvious answer, but if you think of mum, dad, a couple of kids, maybe a dog, if you take a beat and look at the modern world, that traditional nuclear model is rapidly becoming a bit of a historical artifact, really. The definition of family is shifting beneath our feet, and it brings up a massive sociological debate. What counts more, the blood in your veins, or the bonds you choose to forge, nature or nurture? So historically, the concept of family was strictly bound by biology, what scientists called consanguinity. So it was all about lineage, passing down genes, keeping the family name alive, but nowadays, we're moving well beyond that view. Think about adoptive families, step families, foster care, homosexual families, or even chosen families with close-knit communities. Do they count any less? Absolutely not. In fact, if you look at the statistics and recent research, the data paints a fascinating picture of how our baseline reality of kinship has transformed. So according to the recent census data in the UK and other Western countries as well, blended families, meaning families with step-parents or step-siblings, now make up over a third of all households with children. And on top of that, thousands of children are legally adopted or placed in foster care every year. So this means that for millions of people, their everyday flesh and blood reality has nothing to do with shared DNA. And I was reading a brilliant psychological study from the University of Cambridge the other day. It focused on attachment theory with non-traditional families. So the researchers wanted to see if children raised by adoptive parents or step-parents felt any less secure than those in biological families. And do you know what they found? That the emotional bonds, like the sense of cognitive security and the overall development of the children, were identical across the board, provided there was a stable, loving environment. So the brain literally doesn't care about a genetic match. It cares about who shows up, who holds your hand when you're scared, and who is constantly there for you when life gets a bit messy. But despite the science, society can still be a bit funny about it, can't it? Like, we still use language that subtly separates people. So we have terms like stepmother, half-brother, in-laws. Sometimes these labels can make relationships feel a bit secondary, as if they don't quite carry the same weight. And I know people who, they got off on the wrong foot with a new step-parent when they were younger, perhaps feeling like an outsider in their own home. It's incredibly common to feel a bit of friction initially when two entirely different family cultures are forced to merge. In those early stages, it can feel like you're, kind of a bit like chalk and cheese, like totally incompatible with completely different habits and rules. And one family might be loud and chaotic, while the other prefers quiet order. However, over time, as people navigate those awkward growing pains and start to patch things up after these inevitable arguments or disagreements, something beautiful happens. They realise that despite starting on separate paths, they actually have a lot in common. And they build like a shared history, they create their own internal jokes and maybe establish new traditions. And eventually that step label sort of just melts away in daily life. You don't see them as a legal attachment anymore. They're just your family. And it really highlights the rise of the chosen family. This is a concept that's taken off lately, particularly among younger generations or people who, for one reason or another, just don't see eye to eye with their biological relatives. A chosen family consists of those friends, mentors, or partners who step into the void when biological family structures fail. They're the people that you hit it off with instantly, the ones who can completely, open you up, or you can open up to them without any fear of judgment, because let's face it, we don't choose our biological relatives. Sometimes you can share 99% of your DNA with someone and still find that you're a completely different person who simply just cannot get along, no matter how hard you try. And this brings us to a really interesting philosophical crossroads. If a biological relative constantly gives you the cold shoulder, judges your life choices, causes you endless stress, are you obligated to keep them in your life because of a genetic link? Is blood thicker than water, or is it just an outdated cultural trap? It's a tough nut to crack, really, because society puts a massive premium on biological loyalty. We're conditioned to believe that you must love your family unconditional, but the modern psychological consensus is shifting. More and more people are realizing that true kinship is defined by active support, mutual respect, and emotional safety. A real family doesn't demand your compliance, they nurture your growth. So whether your family's made up of biological parents, adopted siblings, a devoted step-parent, or just a tight-knit circle of friends who've always, walked through the fire with you, the conclusion is the same. Family is not a passive noun defined by a birth certificate. It's an active verb defined by how you treat one another daily. And it's about the people who refuse to let you drift apart, the ones who reach out when they know you're struggling, and the ones who make you feel anchored in a chaotic world. And as we move through today's episode, I want you to reflect on your own family framework. Who constitutes your inner circle? Who is the family that you choose? Because in the next segment, we're going to look at how we actually trace these lines back through history and this kind of deep-seated obsession with finding our historical roots and how that can completely change our view of ourselves in the present. We're going to get into this massive global craze of genealogy and family trees. And if you're listening to this and thinking about a relative you haven't spoke to in a while, or maybe you've recently fallen out with someone, try to hold that thought. We're going to explore the complexities of those relationships, the pain of growing apart, and why we're so biologically hardwired to look backward to find out who we are. So stay tuned, because this is where the detective work begins, and I'll be sharing a few secrets from my own journey into the dusty archives of the past. So this massive global obsession with mapping out family trees is what we're going to be tackling next. It's a phenomenon that's absolutely exploded over the last decade. It used to be that genealogy was kind of seen as a bit of a dusty niche hobby, like the sort of thing reserved for retirees with far too much time on their hands, spending their weekends in like cold, damp parish vestries unpicking illegible Victorian handwriting. But today, it's a multi-billion-pound global industry. Companies are selling DNA kits and archival subscriptions, they're raking it in, and millions of ordinary people are completely hooked on tracing their lineage. So what is driving this collective craze? Why are we so suddenly, utterly preoccupied with people who died hundreds of years ago? At its core, it comes down to a very deep-seated identity quest. In our modern, hyper-fast digital world, a lot of people are suffering from a profound sense of rootlessness. We live in an era of unprecedented globalization and urbanization, and we move across continents for work. We live in high-rise flats where we don't even know our neighbours. We spend our lives staring at screens that just feed us random content. We're quite detached from our geographic origins. And genealogy is the ultimate way to kind of re-anchor yourself. It satisfies this primal human urge to know where you fit into this grand tapestry of time. It's an attempt to find continuity in a world that feels incredibly fragmented. And when you find an ancestor from 200 years ago who lived in the very same city you just moved to, your world suddenly expands. You feel a sense of place and a sense of belonging that the modern world so rarely provides. There's also the fascinating element of looking for explanations. So we want to know why we are the way we are. Have you ever wondered why certain traits or quirks or talents seem to run in your family? We love to look back at an old black and white photograph of a great-great-grandfather and say, gosh, he's a chip off the old block, isn't he? He's got the exact same stubborn jawline as my brother. But it goes well beyond physical appearances. People are increasingly turning to family history to understand behavioural patterns, family myths, and even what psychologists call generational trauma. When you unearth the story of an ancestor who survived a famine, or fought through a war, or lost everything in an economic crash, it sheds light on the unspoken anxieties that might have been passed down through your family for generations. It gives you context, and it helps you understand the emotional baseline of your parents and your grandparents, even if you don't always see eye to eye with them in the present. However, digging deep into your family tree is a bit of a double-edged sword. You do have to be prepared for what you might find, because every family tree has its fair share of secrets. You might start your research hoping to find out that you're descended from royalty or some celebrated war hero, but the reality of archival research is often much more complex and, frankly, messy. So for every inspiring story of resilience, you're almost guaranteed to find a skeleton in the closet somewhere. You might uncover a bankruptcy or a criminal record, an illegitimate child who was hushed up, or a bitter legal battle that caused siblings to fall out and never speak again. Now, I was speaking to someone on Ancestry a few weeks ago, and she told me that she'd discovered her great-grandfather had entirely abandoned his first family, changed his name, started a completely new life in another country without ever telling a soul. And obviously his original children spent their entire lives wondering, well, why did he just vanish? Presumably thinking they'd done something to drive him away. Decades later, the truth finally came out via a random DNA match. So it's heavy stuff, really, isn't it? It forces you to reckon with the fact that your ancestors weren't just names on a census page. They were real, flawed human beings making difficult, sometimes terrible choices under immense pressure. And this is where the real work of a genealogist shifts from just simple data collection to a kind of historical empathy. You know, when you look at old ship manifests or workhouse records, you have to try and read between the lines. You begin to realise that the reasons families grew apart or drifted apart in the past are fundamentally the same reasons that they do so today. Poverty, social stigma, mental health struggles. These have been fracturing family units since the dawn of time. When you look at a marriage certificate from 1850 and notice that the bride and groom signed with an X because they couldn't write their own names, your mind automatically starts to paint a picture. They must have faced terrible hardships. If they hadn't moved to the industrial north during the manufacturing boom, their children would have had completely different lives. You start to see how tiny, seemingly insignificant decisions made by people you've never met are the exact reason you're sitting here today, speaking the language you speak, living the life that you live. It really makes you realise that genealogy isn't about escaping your current life, it's about expanding your understanding of it. Kind of turns you into a detective, like a guardian of memory. Because the tragic truth is that most people are completely forgotten within 3 generations of their death. Unless you achieve global fame. Once your grandchildren pass away, your specific quirks, your voice, your struggles, your triumphs, they're usually erased from collective human memory. So doing family history research is a kind of an act of defiance against that erasure. It's saying, I see you, you mattered, and your story is part of my story. So if you've been putting off asking your older relatives about their childhoods, or if you've been hesitating to look into your own background because it feels a bit overwhelming, I want to challenge you to take the first step. Don't worry about building a flawless, massive tree right out the gate. Just start with what you know, talk to the people who are still here, and see where the trail leads. Because as I found on my own journey, which we're going to look at right now, once you start digging into those dusty old archives, you might just find that the past isn't nearly as dead and buried as you think. It's alive, it's kicking, it's waiting to be found. So let's move on to my own personal detective story, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. Now, growing up, I always knew that I had a bit of Italian heritage knocking about on my dad's side of the family. I knew that my great-grandmother's maiden name, or her unmarried name, was Marcantonio, which is about as Italian as it gets. And my dad had actually put together a bit of a family tree, but years prior. But he'd eventually hit a massive brick wall and just abandoned the project altogether. And then after he retired, I decided to buy him an ancestry kit, a DNA kit for his birthday, thinking it'd be a kind of nice hobby for him to pick up to pass the time. But when the results came back, I found myself looking through the data. Just out of curiosity, I decided to create a little digital family tree and plug in a few names. And then I started finding a couple of dates, reading a few records, and before I knew it, I was completely hooked. Like I'd officially caught the genealogy bug. So in the beginning, I only had like basic names and dates of my great-grandparents to go on. So yeah, I took a deep breath, typed them into the online database, and straight away, the system flashed up with all these green hints. Suddenly I had records for marriages, births, christenings, all these relatives I'd never heard of. But that was just like a massive drop in the ocean at first. And it very quickly turned into an absolute avalanche of data. There was so much information to sift through, and it was completely overwhelming. I was trying to find my feet in this digital labyrinth, constantly worrying that some gem would slip through the cracks, and then inevitably I hit my own brick wall. So I was trying to track down my great-great-great-grandfather. All I knew was that he'd originally moved from Italy to Dublin, actually originally to Belfast, and then he moved to Dublin. I had his name, I knew his wife's name, who was also Italian, but I could not find any trace of parents, siblings, and according to old documents, he'd actually crossed over to Ireland when he was just 17 years old, and he'd travelling with a different family who were also called Marcantonio, but he wasn't actually related to them. In the old census records, he was living in their house, but he wasn't listed as a son. And to this day, I've still not gotten to the bottom of that mystery. Like, why was he travelling with them? How does he know them? What relation are they? I have not found any relation to my own Marcantonio family, and it's been years. I don't know if I ever will. But then came the ultimate breakthrough. It taught me a massive lesson about archival research. I suddenly realised that I'd actually found all the correct documents months prior, but I completely ruled them out because I thought the names were wrong. And it turned out that my ancestors' names were just spelt differently on literally every single document I looked at. So think about the context. My Italian relatives could not read or write in English or Italian. So when the Irish census official turned up at their door in Dublin, my ancestors had to verbally say their Italian names to this person who probably never heard an Italian name before, and that official would just write down whatever they thought sounded okay. And it was purely phonetic. And so Marcantonio became completely unrecognisable from one decade to the next, or from one year to the next. His wife's name, again, was Bacigalupo. Again, try saying that in the early 1900s to an Irishman and have it spelt correctly. It's just impossible. And funnily enough, I still struggle with this problem now. Both me and my husband have this exact same issue with our documents in Spain. So neither of us are Spanish. We both live in Spain, and every time we need to do official documents and we have to write our names down, and then a member of staff has to copy our names onto a computer they copy it wrong every single time. I think it was our marriage certificate. My husband's name was wrong. We had to go back and get it corrected. One of my residency papers, it was wrong. They had to correct it. Every single one. Nobody can spell our names correctly. And this is 2026 when everyone can read and write. And I spell the name to them, I write it down, and it's still wrong. So, yeah, 120 years ago, okay, fine. It's fair enough, you can spell it wrong. But once I'd figured out this pattern, that the names were wrong, I managed to piece together what I thought was the correct line, but I needed confirmation from a living family member. So I decided to go on social media and create a private family group. And I told my dad, contact every single cousin you know, add them to this group, and then tell them to do the same. And it spread like wildfire. Within a few weeks, there was over 100 of us in this group who'd never met before. We didn't really know each other. And it was like swapping old black and white photographs, talking about family, telling long forgotten stories. It was incredible to see how many people wanted to connect. And through that group, I finally managed to track down a cousin who was still living in Ireland. Her father happened to be the brother of my great-grandmother. And I reached out to her, and she told me that before her father passed away, he'd told her the exact name of the tiny town in Italy where my family had originally come from. And after a few months of hitting dead ends, I'd finally cracked it. So I knew where my family were from. They're from a tiny town, tiny little village called Piccinisco, in Lazio, kind of 2 hours east of Rome, up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. And they'd come all that way to Ireland and settled there. And the emotional payoff of that discovery was just magnificent. It was so lovely getting to know all these cousins who I didn't even know existed a year before. You know, they sent me photos and I could see my own facial features like reflected in those relatives from across the Irish Sea. And I felt like I finally knew who my ancestors were and that they were real people. And the absolute highlight, though, was when me and my dad decided to go and book a trip to Ireland, and we actually stayed with one of our newly discovered cousins. We spent the week playing detectives in real life. We visited the beautiful old church where my great-grandmother had been christened. And we even walked through the streets of what used to be Little Italy in Dublin, where my ancestors had lived and worked in the 19th century. There was even a plaque on the wall describing Little Italy and how all the musicians would come out and play on New Year's Eve. My great-great-great-grandfather was a musician. He was a violinist, according to the census. And standing in those places, kind of looking at the same stone walls my 3 times great-grandfather had looked at as a lonely 17-year-old immigrant, was truly wonderful discovery. It completely shifted my baseline reality of who I am. And it made me realise that our families don't just exist in the present, we're carrying their history, their struggles, and their resilience in our daily lives. But while my own story has a wonderful, happy ending where everyone came together, it made me look closer at the flip side of modern relationships, because while genealogy can bring a few hundred of cousins together on a Facebook group, modern life is also seeing a terrifying rise in the exact opposite trend, which is people intentionally tearing down their family trees and cutting ties altogether. So in the next section, we're going to change gears and we're going to look at a highly sensitive contemporary phenomenon of family estrangement and why so many people are choosing to walk away from their family. So to understand why family is so vital, we have to look back a few 100,000 years and look at our evolutionary roots. So from a purely biological perspective, the human family unit didn't evolve because it was a cozy social arrangement. It evolved as primitive safety mechanism, basically. It was quite literally a matter of life and death. Human babies are famously some of the most vulnerable and dependent offspring in the entire animal kingdom. And unlike a newborn horse that can stand up and run away from a predator within an hour of being born, a human infant requires years of intensive around-the-clock care just to survive. This extreme dependency forced our ancestors to live in tight-knit groups. If you didn't have a reliable family structure to share resources or protect the young and look out for you when you were sick, you simply wouldn't survive. Isolation in the prehistoric world was basically a death sentence. Because of this, our brains developed an evolutionary safety net, a deep chemical drive to seek social anchorage with a family group. And when we are surrounded by people who are invested in our survival, our nervous system drops its guard, and we experience this sense of safety. In modern psychology, it's known as the buffer effect. Research has constantly shown that a functional, supportive family acts as a psychological safety net against the harshness of the outside world. Life is full of unpredictable traumas, economic crisis, illness, heartbreak, stress. But when you have a stable family unit, that stress is shared, it's buffered. And you know that no matter how badly you get knocked down out there, there's a soft place to land. It gives you the cognitive security to take risks, explore the world, and fail, maybe because you know your inner circle will always be there for you. But what happens when that structure is entirely absent? What happens to the people who, for one reason or another, don't have a family support system to lean on? The data on this is actually a massive wake-up call, and it is something sociologists are studying with increasing urgency. Think about young people who age out of the foster care system without ever being adopted, or elderly individuals who outlive their next of kin. When a person completely loses their social anchorage, the toll on their physical and mental health is devastating. Without a family buffer, individuals are forced to live in a constant state of low-level survival mode. Their bodies are flooded with cortisol, which is the stress hormone, because their primitive safety mechanisms are screaming that they're alone in the wild. This chronic state of hypervigilance completely takes its toll on the body. Medical research has shown that a total lack of deep family or social connections carries a health risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It correlates with drastically higher rates of chronic illness, clinical depression, and significantly shorter lifespans. We talk a lot about this loneliness epidemic in modern society, but the root of the epidemic is often a failure of the family structure. Humans simply cannot thrive in a vacuum. This absolute necessity for a support system is precisely why humans are being so incredibly resilient when their biological networks break down. If we can't find a family by birth, our psychological drive forces us to build one by choice. This is where the concept of chosen families and close-knit community groups becomes powerful. If you fall out with your biological relatives, or if you are completely cut off from your roots, your brain will naturally search for surrogates. And you will look for mentors, to look up to, friends who feel like siblings, and communities where you can finally open up and feel seen. I've seen this time and time again with people who move to a brand new country where they don't know a soul. Initially, they're completely isolated, treading water in an unfamiliar culture, but within a few years, they manage to weave together a beautiful network of chosen family members. And finally, they find people that they hit it off with instantly, and despite being maybe like chalk and cheese on paper, coming from completely different continents or backgrounds, they build a bond that is every bit as strong as shared blood. It really makes you realize that while biology gives us a starting point, it is the psychological safety net of mutual care that actually does the trick. We need to feel that we're part of a continuous story, that our existence matters to someone else, and that our failures won't lead to total abandonment. This is the true value of family. It's not just about passing down your DNA or tracking your surname through our records. It's about creating a safe harbour in a world that often feels incredibly indifferent. But here's the great paradox of the 21st century. At the exact same time that science is proving just how critical family is for our mental and physical survival, society is experiencing a massive, unprecedented shift in how we handle family conflict. We're living in an era where the traditional obligations to stay connected to your relatives at all costs is actively breaking down. More and more people are choosing to walk away from their flesh and blood, turning family estrangement into one of the biggest psychological trends of our time. And in the final section, we're going to go straight into this complex, highly sensitive territory. We're going to explore why so many adult children are choosing to cut someone off and why families are growing apart at an alarming rate, and whether this new trend is a healthy liberation from toxic multi-generational patterns or a symptom of a hyper-individualistic society that's dangerously dismantling our primary safety net. So historically, the act of intentionally cutting off a biological relative was viewed as a massive cultural taboo. It was the sort of thing people only spoke about in hushed whispers over a cup of tea, a shameful family secret hidden away in the dark, because it usually implied that you'd basically lost the plot entirely or committed a crime or done something completely unforgivable. For generations, an unspoken, rigid societal contract governed family dynamics. It dictated that no matter how poorly your relatives treated you, no matter how much you clashed, suffered, felt miserable in their presence, you simply had to endure it. You had to keep up appearances for the sake of wider community, swallow your grievances, and remain completely loyal to the unit because the ancient proverb, blood is thicker than water, was treated as an absolute unshakable law. But if we look at the modern world, the cultural landscape has shifted dramatically. If you spend any time whatsoever scrolling social media platforms, you'll find yourself entering a completely different universe. On these feeds, the act of cutting someone off or severing ties with family members is no longer framed as a tragic last resort or a personal failing. Instead, it's actively celebrated or encouraged as like the ultimate act of self-care. It's framed as a courageous milestone in a person's mental health journey. And what used to be a rare, kind of painful family tragedy is transformed into a mainstream psychological lifestyle trend, particularly among Gen Z and millennials. More and more adult children are deciding that they're no longer willing to inherit or pass down multi-generational trauma, toxic behavior patterns, or emotional dysfunction to their own offspring. And if you're sitting there thinking that this is a minor internet craze confined to a few angry people just screaming into the void, the raw data is quite shocking. So recent sociological studies out of major universities in the UK and the US suggested that nearly 1 in 5 families are currently affected by some form of active estrangement. The overwhelming majority of these cases involve an adult child making the conscious, deliberate decision to cut ties completely with a parent, a sibling, or an entire extended family. On one hand, you have the highly compelling psychological argument for this personal liberation. Proponents of this view argue that no human should ever be forced to endure emotional abuse, chronic manipulation, gaslighting, or cruel criticism just because they happen to share DNA or a birth certificate with their abuser. For these individuals, walking away, giving someone else cold shoulder is not a flippant choice. It is a vital survival mechanism. It's a way to stop this hostile, draining home environment and finally give themselves the psychological safety net required to heal and grow and build self-esteem. They choose to draw a definitive line in the sand and state, my peace of mind, my mental health, my dignity matter for far more than an accidental genetic link. And in many cases, making this incredibly painful break is the exact catalyst that allows them to thrive, enabling them to discover a spectacular chosen family of supportive friends who actually treat them with respect and love. But on the flip side of the coin, an increasing number of sociologists and family counsellors are looking at this explosion of family breakdown with a profound, growing sense of dread. They argue that we're living in an era of hyper-individualism where the sophisticated language of modern therapy is being weaponized to justify discarding relationships the moment they become slightly uncomfortable or inconvenient. So let's get real for a second. Family relationships, they're naturally messy and complicated and frequently frustrating. Human beings are inherently flawed, and when you're forced into a lifelong bond with people you didn't choose, you are bound to fall out from time to time. You're guaranteed to disagree on politics, or lifestyle choices, or money. The dangerous side of this modern estrangement trend is that instead of doing the hard, exhausting, emotional work required to communicate and compromise, people are increasingly encouraged by online echo chambers to simply cut the cord at the first sign of friction. It transforms human relationships into something transactional and disposable. If a parent says something insensitive, or if a sibling doesn't see eye to eye with you on a life choice, the modern advice is often to label them as toxic and ghost them permanently. But remember what we discovered when looking at our evolutionary biology? Human beings are hardwired to need continuous primary safety net. When we systematically dismantle the biological family unit over minor disagreements, we risk severely worsening the global loneliness epidemic. We're actively destroying the primary foundational networks that are supposed to keep us anchored when we hit rock bottom. Where exactly do we draw the line between protecting our personal peace and completely abandoning our family responsibilities? Navigating family life, whether you're digging deep into historical archives to connect with the ghosts of your ancestors from 200 years ago, or trying to manage a highly volatile relationship with a parent, it requires an immense amount of emotional stamina. It's a continuous, delicate balancing act between nature and nurture, blood and bond, the past that shaped us and the present that we are trying to build. And that brings us to the very end of today's episode of the Advanced English podcast. It has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the complex world of kinship. I really hope it's given you some food for thought, a fantastic range of high-level advanced idioms and phrasal verbs to use in your upcoming C1 or C2 exams. If you want to make sure that none of these high-level vocabulary gems slip through the cracks, don't forget to click the link in the description right now to get your hands on the full transcript of today's conversation, and even better, make sure you head straight over to our vocabulary platform. The link is also in the description. You can interactively practice all the vocabulary from today's episode, including phrasal verbs, idioms, and collocations. If you found this lesson helpful and want to help the channel grow, please do spread the love, give us a like, share the episode with a fellow English friend, and hit that subscribe button so you're always in the loop whenever a new episode drops. Before I call it a day, I have a little challenge for you this week. Head down to the comments section and tell me, have you ever looked into your own family history? What's the most surprising or interesting story you discovered about your ancestors? Or if you're brave enough, let me know your thoughts on the estrangement debate. Is blood thicker than water? Or is it an outdated concept? I'd love to hear your responses. Thank you so much for tuning in, for sticking with me through the archives, and for being such a wonderful part of this learning community. Until next time, keep digging into the details, stay curious, and most importantly, keep on top of your English. I'll see you in the next episode. Cheers for now. Bye.